one of the most complex organs we've ever known, and when that organ becomes disordered, it's assumed that its effects can be very detrimental. Although they're both characterized as the same, neurological and psychiatric disorders are very different, and in my personal opinion, the main difference is that psychiatric disorders are a little bit more mysterious than neurological ones. If you really think about it, right, in neurological disorders, you have the ability to physically look at where the disorder is. For example, if a neurologist suspects a tumor, they have the ability to locate the tumor via an X-ray, and then a neurosurgeon will operate on the tumor physically. And, for example, we consider, let's say, an orthopedist. If they suspect a skeletal illness, they have the ability to, via X-rays, discuss and find where this fracture really is, and then base treatment off of that. But in psychiatry, this really isn't possible, and the diagnosis and treatment mechanisms have pretty much been constant over decades. Let's come to the diagnosis mechanisms. So, for example, right now, the main method of diagnosis is the consideration of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, otherwise known as the DSM-5, in accordance with patient-reported symptoms. The treatments are also pretty simple to comprehend and basically include psychotherapy, in addition to medication depending on the severity of the mental illness. We also have other types of therapies, such as transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is a type of brain stimulation, but it just hasn't been used in recent times. So with this information mentioned in mind, you may wonder where the talk is really going to go, because right now there doesn't really seem to be a problem that can be resolved. And to be honest, when I was first introduced to this field, I also thought the same. Although it seemed to be a little simple, I realized that psychiatry was just in general a complex field. And even though there were many aspects to it, there is one problem that I didn't really realize, and that is refractory mental illness. Refractory mental illness is basically just a mental illness that doesn't respond to medication. And this illness is very, very difficult to handle. This is because a lot of complex psychiatric disorders, such as schizophrenia and dissociative identity disorder, are very difficult to manage without medication and therapy. As a result, I realized that there must be a type of research that had to change the perception of the psychiatric industry. And in order to find this, I looked across multiple publications and spent hours and hours analyzing a lot of newer ideas. And I was able to find one singular idea that really changed my mind towards psychiatry. And before I introduce that to you guys, I'd like to mention 3 things. The first is that this idea will be presented in a more comprehensive manner so that it's easier for others to comprehend. So there will be a lack of scientific detail, but that is purposeful. The second is the monoamine hypothesis. Although it may sound a little complex, it simply highlights the correlation between a lower neurotransmitter concentration and a higher susceptibility to mental illness. So for example, depression has been established to have a lower neurotransmitter concentration, especially in serotonin, and the medication that addresses depression, known as selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, attempts to increase this neurotransmitter concentration of serotonin. And lastly is the blood-brain barrier and its relevance to the research. The blood-brain barrier is simply a barrier between the blood, the brain, and the rest of the central nervous system. One thing to note about the blood-brain barrier is actually that it's really hard to cross through. And it makes sense as to why. Because if we were to easily cross through the blood-brain barrier, we would have alienated substances that presented themselves in the brain. And it would be hard for the brain to function in general. With that being in mind, I will now introduce the research to you guys, which is the idea of the molecular Trojan horse presented by Dr. William Partridge. And it has been elaborated upon by various other scientists, but the conceptual basis still remains the same. And yet, I'm going to delay the introduction to the research one more time by presenting to you guys a couple analogies. Let's say someone is knocking at your door, right? And you're looking through the people and you're wondering who that really is. And let's say you see that person and they're dressed strangely, they're acting quite weird, and just to be honest, very suspicious. Your instinct is to be not opening the door because you don't recognize that individual. But let's say those people were your parents. You're obviously going to open the door because you know who they are and you're familiar with them. And another analogy is the Trojan horse. The Trojan horse was a mechanism used by the Greeks in order to get their way inside shore, and they did that by hiding themselves under a wooden Trojan horse, thereby winning. You can now maybe extrapolate how this may relate to the idea of the molecular Trojan horse, but at a neurobiological level. In order to reverse the monomy hypothesis, which was aforementioned, you are trying to get a particle across the brain, and that particle may be a neurotransmitter particle, which is attempting to increase neurotransmitter concentration. But this cannot be done quite easily because of the blood-brain barrier and its restrictions. So we create a facade. The facade will simply be a mechanism to trick the blood-brain barrier into letting the particle in by telling it that you do actually know this particle and covering itself in a particle that it actually recognizes. So once this particle gets across, not only do you have the ability to increase neurotransmitter concentration, it's also possible in even other fields of medication and mental illness and even other fields of medicine in general for neurobiological manipulation to happen. So with this research being presented, you may wonder now, what is really the significance of it? And if I'm being really honest right now, I was being really ironic when I first began this research. You may notice I said the word monomy hypothesis like multiple times during the speech just because of how important it is in the field of psychiatry. And that is the same hypothesis I wanted to ultimately prove wrong. And you may wonder why, right? If it's present everywhere, then why would I want to say it's wrong? Well, that is actually the reason I wanted to say it's wrong, because it's present everywhere thus far, and we haven't really had any significant psychiatric revelations because of the monomy hypothesis. So I automatically assumed that since it's everywhere and we still haven't gotten anything from it, it had to be wrong, and the real idea had to be something developed from the ground up, and it had to be completely different from all the other research that has been presented by psychiatrists. When I first discovered the molecular Trojan horse, I didn't realize its correlation to the monomy hypothesis, and I was so excited to have found something that I thought was completely different. But when I read on and on, I realized it was actually just the monomy hypothesis, but repurposed. Not only was this useful to me in research, the idea that sometimes you have to look the same place you've already seen, rather than developing an idea from the ground up. This was important for me in research, but also in personal values in general, because I genuinely try to develop things that are newer and better and more different in comparison to other people, because I don't want to be seen as the same individual or having the same idea, which is why I try to think outside the box almost every opportunity I'm presented with. But this research told me that sometimes it's not really about attempting to do something different from other people, but learning more about what you already know in order to have a more comprehensive understanding and developing a newer idea can just stem from that. It doesn't have to be something you start off immediately. But just looking in the same place, it's not a bad idea, and